So now we have Michael and Tim who will be talking about their paper CGC Monitor, a vetting system for DARPA Cyber Grant Challenge.
Hi, thanks for sticking around for the last paper presentation anyway. Looks like a few more people have trickled in since breakfast. So I'm Tim and this is Mike, and we both worked on the DARPA Cyber Grant Challenge program for about 3 years, and that concluded just under 2 years ago now at the DEFCON conference in Las Vegas. So we wanted to, it took a little bit to get through all of the disclosure and vetting the system processes for getting information out from the project. This is sometimes the case with government work. But we wanted to talk about a little piece of the integrity system that was sort of forensically doing some forensics on submissions from competitors. So the overview slide, that sort of required academic overview slide, I'm going to give some background on the CGC program itself and motivate the need for integrity, and then switch it over to Mike, who's going to go over some of the details of the vetting system and broadly talk about reverse execution. So who's heard of capture the flag contests? Yeah, and in the context of cybersecurity, right? And I guess how many people did the rodeo last night? About the same people, it looks like. So we won't spend too much time talking about CTF, but I do want to make the distinction of there's two broad classes of CTF, and the rodeo took one class, went one direction last night with the Jeopardy board style, where you sort of choose your own adventure. You can pick the challenge that you're doing by picking the square or whatever the game board looks like. And there's a whole other class, which is typically dubbed attack defend, where the contestants are simultaneously trying to defend some information system while exploiting vulnerabilities in a similar system that the other contestants are operating. And often those are directly attached and might happen over traditional network sockets and TCP and things like that. In this context, it's a security-based capture the flag, cybersecurity-based, right? It's not the game that kids are playing physically. It's not the first-person shooter that's available on the Xbox or the PlayStation or whatever. And typically these puzzles are involving demonstrating some level of proficiency in a particular skill set. So it might be like a forensics problem, it might be a reverse engineering problem, a network security problem, crypto, and so forth. So there's different models for organizing how these contests actually work. So you might structure the contest to try and educate novice people to make them more experts. You might structure it to achieve particular learning objectives, and there's different ways to structure the contest itself. So there's sort of the game for the organizers is structuring the contest such that the participants are navigating the game in the way that you want to demonstrate that level of proficiency. So these things are increasingly common. 10 years ago, there were only a handful of them. Now you can basically participate in them about every other week, and some of them have serious prizes where if you were a skilled enough individual or team, you could basically make a living by winning these contests year-round. And also, I wanted to note that today the character CTF is sort of becoming more and more ambiguous. It almost just means contest these days. So I think DEFCON has like 27 CTFs in the coming weeks, and a lot of them don't fit into that classic mold of sort of the Jeopardy style of the attack defend. So the game flow, this is a specific type of CTF, and this is the one that applies to attack defend CTF, and this is the one that applies to how the CGC game works. So that has some like added context for the next slides. One thing that was particularly curious about, or somewhat novel about the CGC design, is that it was attack defend, but the attackers and the defenders were not directly connected to each other. So in the old days, so to speak, the different participants might literally be plugged into the same network switch, and you can more or less directly attack by opening just sockets, right? You just connect to them and try and exploit a vulnerability. In CGC and in a few other contests, it's a broker game. So all of the game moves, so to speak, are mediated by some central party. In our case, it was a competition infrastructure, which was quite a large set of hardware and software, which we'll talk a little bit about. We'll tell you about the pieces that are interesting for the forensics harness. And this is a huge endeavor by many people over 3 years. So if we're glossing over a part that was interesting to you, like feel free to grab us and ask us about it. It was pretty exciting work, and we're pretty enthusiastic to talk about it. So it's a broker game. So the infrastructure mediates everything. There's an API. Part of the CGC, I get a little ahead of myself, but part of the CGC mission was autonomy. So the APIs were designed to be run without humans in the interface. So all the interfaces were machine readable and designed to be used by machines. And roughly the downloading software that was meant to be analyzed, and then uploading software that was affecting the different offensive and defensive moves they could make in the game. So these are modified replacement binaries. To give you a little bit more insight into what the competition infrastructure looked like on the inside, so not what the competitor was controlling, but what the competitor was affecting in their moves and their uploads. We had different physical hosts on the infrastructure side for each team. So each team had a set of hosts depicted here allocated for them on the infrastructure racks. And the easiest one to start with is the defended host off to your right-hand side. And this is where the vulnerable software runs. So this is all binary software. We call them challenge binaries. And these are the services that have the known vulnerabilities in them that have to be detected and then taken advantage of, and also modified to be defended so that the other participants can't take advantage of it on your defended host. So we, the infrastructure team, manage this, and the moves are uploaded by the participants, and then we place the modified binaries in a running state on the defended host. So since nothing can interact directly, we need a way to exercise the challenge binaries as they go through their different types of behaviors. So if you think about a web server, you need to have the different HTTP requests coming into the web server and exercising the different features of the web server. So this sort of benign or expected behavior is done by the poller in your upper left, the guy with the little checkbox. So he's sort of making sure that all of the functionality that's expected of that service are still true. So exercising all the different aspects of the web server, so to speak. And then, because this is a broker game, the proof of vulnerability, which you might call an attack against the vulnerability, it can't be launched directly by a participant. So these again are uploaded to this broker interface, and then they are launched on behalf of the participant by the competition infrastructure. So we have a dedicated machine down here called the POV machine, and those different colored boxes are indicating different participants that have placed a move to launch an attack against this particular the set of hosts on this slide for this participant. So here, 3 different opponents have registered their intent to launch a proof of vulnerability against this defended host. So all of the polls, the benign interactions, and the POVs, the attempts at proving vulnerability or the attacks, are sent towards the defended host, and that's all through a network IDS. So everything is mediated through the IDS, and the participant that is associated with this defended host has an opportunity to not only replace the services, but also introduce intrusion detection rules, network style, smart style rules to mitigate attacks. So then, in addition to one other piece on this slide, is that in addition to the interface that allows you to change the software in the game, there's also a tap, like a mirror port feed that comes from the IDS that goes to the CRS. So all of the participants get 2 cables, a bidirectional API cable and then a unidirectional tap from IDS. So what does it look like? Well, CTF-wise, if anybody watches the Mr. Robot stuff, there was an episode where they went through and they kind of depicted this party-like environment with a rodeo style Jeopardy-style game board at the end. Looks like this. It's not the most, CTF is not the most spectator-friendly sport. You see a lot of people like looking at computers, just working at their keyboard. And so you think like, well, what is the Hollywood representation? Well, it looks a lot like this, what it actually looks like in real life. So there is a little bit of, quite a bit of truth or reality there. So if you look at DEF CON just a few years ago, got a picture from DEF CON 2016, and you can go all the way back to like 2012, like pretty much looks the same. I mean, if it's all in the cyber realm, it's all people hunkering over keyboards much as you are right now. So the DEF CON 1 is one of the longest running contests in this space, and it's often called the World Series or the Super Bowl of CTF. Right, so it's just a picture. So then, to anchor that back into CGC, right, so this is like the DARPA, DoD funded program, the Cyber Grand Challenge. Well, if you boil it down to just a small phrase, the research question was, could you automate all of that? Right? Like you're typically saying that this is human driven, you're trying to exercise specific subject matter expertise in crypto, in forensics, in reverse engineering. So DARPA likes to automate things, they like to build robots, they like to make large technology small, right? So could a purpose-built computer actually play this sort of Super Bowl of CTFs? So if we distill that down, you need autonomous binary analysis, patching, vulnerability discovery, service resiliency, and because there's an IDS component to network IDS. So if we're going through the pictures and saying what it looked like, so this is what CGC ended up looking like. So instead of a bunch of hackers wearing black t-shirts and a computer sitting at keyboards, because it's autonomous, we have racks of machines that are sitting there like doing the things that the humans used to. So it's sort of even less spectator friendly, right? Like you don't even have a person sitting at a keyboard, you just have a rack that you are taking on faith that is making similar actions to what used to happen. But even so, this isn't a rendering. This kind of looks like an artistic rendering. This is like a real picture. It's very colorful and saturated kind of environment. But much like a golf game or whatever, it was very long running, but the last portion of the event was live streamed and done as a live event in Las Vegas. So there were crowds, and you take this spectator unfriendly environment of having the racks, and you try and find ways to engage the audience with visualizations and explanations and commentators and so forth. And it was quite the event. Again, it was 3 years. There were qualifiers. There were final. There was the final event is the one that we're talking about the most, which is where the forensics harness came into play. And you can see that there were 100 qualified applicants down to 7 finalists. So right from the beginning, from more than 3 years before the final event, there were critical concerns about the integrity of the game. Integrity is one point. So we wanted it to be very repeatable. So there were great lengths into increasing the determinism and different aspects of the architecture and the implementation of the game. And then skipping down to the bottom bullet, we wanted to also make lots of related data sets available to continue research in the field. So not only the different corpuses of corpora of binaries and the results from the event itself, but the places where we couldn't have high determinism, we wanted to record so that the event could be replicated, the results could be replicated. And then crucial to today's presentation was the competition integrity. So we have lots of inputs from competitors, and these competitors are some of the best hackers, and what they do are subvert CTF systems and try and win at all costs, right? So there's a lot of concern both from who the participants are, and then also the purse and the prize money at stake. So there was a little under $7 million at stake, and $7 million is enough, but it's also $7 million that is coming from the United States government, right? So there's like this additional layer of sort of need for integrity and desire to not be subverted. So this is a pretty dense slide, but I wanted to highlight the lengths that we were going to in different aspects of the game, which will some kind of motivate some of the intensity to the forensics harness. But the randomness, we even limited randomness available to user space so that people couldn't, we needed the reproducibility, so we couldn't have the randomness that you might get from a typical machine, but we also couldn't let people predict what was going to happen at any particular space so that they could try and game the system. So we went to lengths such as using a deterministic pseudorandom number generator to see the different aspects of randomness available in user space. But the seeding for that couldn't be controlled by DARPA, who could then predict the outcome of the game. It couldn't be controlled by a unique participant, so we mixed inputs from all the different participants and from DARPA, and we committed to the seeds ahead of time, we committed to the schedule of CD release ahead of time, and tried to really take all the different ways that you could game the system and give yourself advantage, and take it away while still maintaining the repeatability aspect so that people could redo experiments. We even committed to kernel versions years in advance, which months and months in advance, which is really annoying when you're trying to keep up with security updates. You have the backport patches. The reason we committed to the kernel, the primary reason was for supply chain concerns. Right? Could people actually manipulate the game by subverting the entire infrastructure by committing something or understanding some vulnerability in a kernel after the announcement of the competition, but before the competition was ever done. We designed an architecture that only had 7 system calls, so the environment is very reduced compared to a modern operating system that would have hundreds of system calls. Even in that case, all of our public systems were released on a were released on a Linux-based 32-bit kernel, and our production systems are on a 64-bit FreeBSD kernel. So think about all the complexities of making those two systems appear the same from user space. Like anybody that's gone to the OS internals, there's a huge lift in making those appear identical to user space software. And then, again, just driving home the lengths towards integrity, we had a physical air gap, so lifted stage off the floor, so you didn't have additional network cables going into the different competitor machines. This was fully autonomous, so when the game started, all the designers of the software had to just step back and watch, and we're not allowed to manipulate anything. You couldn't restart services, you couldn't change software, it was completely hands-off, so there was a physical air gap. Power and cooling went through this transparent bridge thing to try and demonstrate that there was really nothing crossing the air gap. For production needs, the one thing that did cross the air gap was a unidirectional robot that took optical media from the inside and dropped it on the outside. Expensive contractor project. So competitors had to be autonomous, but organizers didn't. So but organizers had to observe air gap rules. So as we went in and out refereeing the system during the event, cell phones couldn't go in and out, no wireless connectivity, dedicated analysis machines on the inside, and so forth. So now I'm going to dive a little deeper into the specific integrity control for the CGC monitor, the forensic harness.
Hi, and I'm Mike Thompson. I'm from the Navy Postgraduate School, and this is what I worked on primarily over those 3 years. So our goal was to vet all of the competitor software that we got before it ran on, or as it was running on the competition infrastructure. So in order to do that, we simulated or duplicated the entire CGC infrastructure on Civic's full system simulator. So we simulated the game and used that to vet the software. The simulation included multiple components. All of the game services, the operating system that Tim described, that was all simulated. And so we monitored the operating system for execution and data integrity while the software, computer supplied software was running. And we used a high fidelity x86 model from Intel in order to sort of anchor the simulation. We built the monitor on Cimex primarily using breakpoints and callbacks. So if you work with dynamic virtual machine introspection, you might understand some of those challenges. None of the monitoring functions were running on the system itself. In order to achieve this, we built custom operating system awareness, based on the internals of the operating systems, and we had to do that for both 32-bit and 64-bit versions of Linux and FreeBSD. And so we even had simulations running with heterogeneous mixes of those. And during the competition, all of that was running on 32-blade servers, which we ran multiple instances of the simulated CGC infrastructure so that we could vet all of those competitors like software solutions. So those submissions included the proofs of vulnerabilities that Tim described, the replacement challenge binaries, and the filters that the competitors issued for their IDSs. So while any of those things were scheduled for execution on the kernel, we monitored the kernel for things like and that would be execution of return instructions that don't appear to follow calls. We monitored for modification to kernel page tables, modification of user credentials, such as trying to change a user ID to maybe 0, and execution of any code that didn't have any business executing while a particular competitor submission was running. So all of those things were done during the game to look for attempts to subvert the infrastructure. We also, as we were doing this, had the ability to generate artifacts while we were monitoring. So of course, any events that were anomalous we would record. We could also create full execution traces that included data references, system call logs of everything that happened during the game. We could generate records for successful proofs of vulnerabilities, that is, successful exploits within the game, instances of ROP or stack execution by the actual applications, which is what they were trying to do and what we were expecting to see. We could record that, and of course, the services. So that's sort of an overview of the monitoring side. Needless to say, we didn't discover anybody trying to subvert the infrastructure. But another component that we built into this simulator was the ability to actually look at the successful exploits and try to understand what bugs were being exploited. And so this was sort of my favorite part of this part of the project, and that allowed me to run a computer backwards in order to figure out what the exploits were. So to put it in the context, imagine a real-world analogy where you have a fuzzer that has managed to generate a crashing input for some service. And so you got this output from the fuzzer, you know it crashes the service, and maybe you know it gives you control of the IP. That tells you precisely nothing, well, almost nothing about the actual bug that you're doing. CGC demonstrated quite well that you can exploit a bug in a service without really understanding what that bug is or where the bug is. In CGC, the competitors found 20 vulnerabilities in 82 of the challenge sets that we gave them to work on. But the question was, what was the flaws? Whether they were actually even exploiting the intended flaws that the authors put into the software. So if you looked at the patches that the competitors issued against those catalog software, that really wouldn't tell you anything about the actual bug that was being exploited, because the patches themselves were generic in nature. They didn't really fix the bugs. So in order to answer this question, we re-instrumented the simulator to analyze the applications as opposed to watching the operating system. And what this gave us was the ability to have an analyst start up a session, and that session would then pause when something interesting happened, like a proof of vulnerability. The analyst could then reverse execution to help him or her understand what the nature of the bug was. And to do that, we combined a IDAPRO debugger and used that as a front end to our CGC monitor, which was built on the Cimex full system simulator. So imagine you've got a IDAPRO session that you're running. It looks just like any IDA debugger session. And in this case, you can't see it, but I'm looking at a function call pointer, in which I know that, say, the content of ECX is corrupt. And I'm interested at this point in knowing where that value came from. What's the provenance of that corrupt register? So reverse execution becomes very helpful to answer that question. So I can actually run backwards to start answering that question using functions that we built into an IDAPRO plugin. So our IDA Pro client includes the usual sort of debugger functions, but in reverse. And so I can say, run backwards till you hit a breakpoint. I can say things like, step backwards over the current function or into the current function. I can put the cursor somewhere in the code and say, run backwards to that. I can say, run backwards until this particular register has been modified back in time. I can set and jump around to bookmarks, interesting places in the execution. And I can semi-automate back tracing of data. So if I'm interested in the provenance of content in memory, I can say run backwards and generate bookmarks until you find the source of that particular data. So I'll quickly look at the subsystem that makes this happen. You're interacting with the IDA Pro. Say you want to jump backwards to where that arrow is up at the top. The client then is going to send over to the CGC monitor using sort of an out-of-band send monitor command. It's going to send the address to where I want to go backwards to. The CGC monitor then is going to call down to the Cimex engine and say, hey, the next time you stop, for whatever reason, come to this callback. I tell it where to break, and then I tell it to run, and it then starts running backwards, executing backwards, or at least looking like it's executing backwards, till it gets to some breakpoint. It might be the breakpoint I set, it might have been some other breakpoint, because of course I'm debugging, I want it to run until it hits a breakpoint. When it hits a breakpoint, it stops, and tells my IDA client at this point that it's stopped, and where it is stopped. The interesting thing here is that IDA Pro, up until this point, hasn't been involved in that particular sequence. It doesn't know where it is right now. So I then call down into IDA Pro and I say, hey, set a breakpoint at this address. And I tell it to set the breakpoint at what happened, what I know is the current address. And so it then talks using its normal debugger interface to the debug server and says, run to this breakpoint. And the server says, oh yeah, I'm already there. Okay, I'm there, I'm done. I ran to your breakpoint. IDA is now happy and it queries the server in order to get its registers and its memory updated. So now from the user's perspective, IDA has run backwards and it now knows the current system state. So I can look at register content, memory content, and such. So how do we get this reverse execution? How does Cimex provide that illusion? Well, it's very resource intensive. What it does is as you're running forward, it records a series of micro checkpoints. And then it references those checkpoints during reverse execution, essentially iterating over each one, then running forward until it hits a breakpoint, and it keeps doing that until it decides that it has hit the most recent breakpoint of interest. The challenge, though, is that progression of running backwards isn't strictly serial, so you're going to hit a lot of breakpoints that you wouldn't normally hit. So if you have associated callbacks with those breakpoints, you're going to get a lot of noise and a lot of garbage, so you can't really use those callbacks when you're running backwards. So to review what we found, we used that harness in order to analyze all of the successful POVs in the event. Of 82 challenge sets, there were 109 intended vulnerabilities built into the services. 20 of those had working POVs in the final event, so the competitors found 20 exploits. Turns out that half of those working POVs were not even what the author intended. 6 were actually bugs that were unknown to the author that they put in. 2 of the services were exploited by the same bug, happened to be a shared library that had an unintended exploit in it. 4 of the bugs were the intended bug, but they were exploited in a way that the author did not intend. And then all of the exploits within the game, that is everything that everybody found, was basically the same. They all found the same bug and exploited it the same way. The tool was also able to generate automatic back traces of data. So this is up as part of the CGC corpus that's online. You can see the back traces that this reverse execution generated. So you'll see the sources of corrupt memory locations and call registers, that sort of thing. In the future, what we'd like to do is extend this tool to more general execution environments. As Tim described, the decree environment that the game ran on had only 7 system calls. We'd like to expand it for a full set. And we'd like to make the tool as sort of a service, so that somebody sitting out with IDA Pro on a workstation connect to the service and run software backwards to help find the bugs. The monitoring or analysis is up on GitHub at these links. The source for the monitor is there, but you would have to bring your own CIMICs. So I'd like to close by noting that the U.S. government has a couple hundred copies, unused copies of licenses to use this CIMICs-based monitor. Those are available on a number of repurposed supercomputers that CGC or that DARPA distributed after the competition. And so I'd like to find government people who might be interested in locating those and setting up, CIMICs-based monitoring. Questions?
Are there any questions? So I thought that this was one of the more interesting papers that I've read, just because it's so unique. Do you have any thoughts on how this might be useful outside of the challenge? Like, is it generally useful, or is this just something, in your opinion, that was a really cool way of solving this one problem?
Well, I think the analyst tool is generally useful from the perspective of, well, two perspectives. The most useful one is helping train people who are going to do reverse engineering that need to understand and comprehend what's happening to an application while it's being exploited. So if you think about bringing up IDAPRO and trying to analyze what the vulnerable software is doing, if you have the ability to run backwards on your, to answer questions that you have in your own mind, I think it gives you the ability to much better comprehend what's happening. So from a training and a education perspective, I think it's a useful tool. I think the automated backtracing is also very helpful in actually identifying the bug. That old problem of, yeah, I can exploit that thing, but can I patch it? Can I figure out what the bug is? I think it's a good contribution to the field of being able to automate the process of actually identifying the true bug so I can patch it.
The DARPA released kind of an after-action video or something within the last year. It's quite long, but it's worth watching. And they also showed sort of they used a visualization to kind of show the exploits. Is that related to this at all, or is that a different project?
It's a different project. That project didn't really show what was happening. It showed what it looked like, what was happening, but you couldn't like say where something happened, or see a buffer overflow, or see that somebody trashed a call there. So yeah, this was separate.
Different project, and they actually came to their visualization data through a completely different path. So they were outside their data, so they were operating their data that came off of those optical discs. So they knew the outcomes, so like how scores were generated, whether proof of vulnerabilities were successful or not, and the team pairings and things like that. But when it came to execution trace, that was all done in a competing system, so to speak. They weren't interlocked for reasons.
All right, so we've, you have anything to say? So after Elizabeth talks, we have a break until 10:45.
A couple of announcements as we go into the break. The most important one, if you want to be part of the Works in Progress